Good evening, family, and I greet you. You see, this is the Atlantic Ocean. To some, it's a form of entertainment, but to some, it covers a very dark history, a history that is very horrible, and that many people have been affected with this very ocean, with the trade that was going on during the time of the slavery. The Atlantic Ocean is very big and deep. Long ago, from the 16th to the 19th century, people used this ocean for a terrible trade called the Triangle Trade. This trade route connected Europe, Africa, and the two Americas. Ships from Europe carried goods to Africa. In Africa, these goods were traded for people who were forced into slavery. These enslaved people were taken on ships across the Atlantic Ocean. This journey was called the Middle Passage. It was very hard and many people suffered and died. When the ship reached Americas, the enslaved people were sold and forced to work on farms and plantations.
We can only begin to imagine the sheer horror of the slave trade. But what if we could place an actual ancestor within that story?
They worked very hard to grow crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These crops were sent back to Europe, completing the triangle shape of the trade route. This trade caused a lot of pain and changed the lives of many African people. It has also made a huge impact on the history and cultures of the America. The transatlantic slave trade is a horrible, horrible thing that has ever happened to mankind. This ocean right now bears a long history. Cape Coast bears a long history, and that's why I normally take part in creating videos to show you how much I empathize, how much I sympathize with Black Americans and the African diaspora. The slave trade that took place split us into two. We were one, but we were separated by Africans and some Americans, or rather Europeans, who were greedy. Now, in this story of the triangular slave trade, there is one thing that has always bothered my mind. The very idea that one human being would be so greedy to the extent of selling another human being, that has always stayed with me for a very long time. The reason why we have Black Americans, the reason why we have Black people in the Caribbean, and we have Black people in Europe as well as in the Southern America, is because some of us Africans, we were so greedy. We were blinded by greed. We were blinded by material things.
Constructions of white Americans from antiquity to the present, because it explores a concept that lies within a history of events. I have chosen this strategy because race is an idea, not a fact, and its questions demand answers from the conceptual rather than the factual realm. American history offers up a large bounty of commentary on what it means to be non-white, moving easily between alterations in the meaning of race as color, from colored to Negro to Afro-American to Black to African American, always associating the notion of blackness with slavery. But little attention has been paid to history's equally confused and flexible discourses on the white races and the old slave trade from Eastern Europe. I use white races in the plural because for most of the past centuries, when race really came down to matters of law, educated Americans believed in the existence of more than one European race. It is possible and important to investigate that other side of history without trivializing the history we already know so well.
Here is something that I want you to understand about the capturing of African Americans, or rather Africans before. In the heart of Africa, villages thrived with rich cultures and traditions. However, the arrival of European traders in the 16th century marked the beginning of a dark era. These European traders sought human lives to fuel the labor demands of the New World. We understand that Europe was undergoing industrial revolution, but the problem is that they didn't have enough labor supply. For this reason, these people sought to come to Africa and sought for labor. But how did they capture our brothers and sisters? The process often began with raids. European traders, in collaboration with the local African leaders and merchants, would organize expeditions to capture Africans. These raids were brutal. They teared families apart, and devastating communities is what they also did. Sometimes individuals were captured during wars between rival tribes, with the winning tribe selling their prisoners to the traders as slaves. Now remember, by the beginning of the video I told you about the journey from Africa to America. This journey was called the Middle Passage. Now, once captured, the enslaved person or people were marched to the coast. The Cape Coast Castle is a very good example. Now, once Africans were captured as slaves, they often endured long and grueling journeys. Upon reaching the coast, they were held in forts or barracoons, awaiting transport. The journey across the Atlantic, which was also known as the Middle Passage, was horrific. It was packed tightly into the hulls of ships. The enslaved endured inhuman conditions. They experienced diseases, malnutrition, and abuse was rampant. Many Africans did not survive this Middle Passage. Now, once they arrived in America, the survivors were sold at auctions. They were inspected like livestock, with buyers assessing their physical condition and strength. Families were often separated, with individuals sold to different owners. The enslaved were then forced to work on plantations, in mines, and in households, contributing to the economic growth of the colonies. This was very sad. Imagine our grandfathers did this to the grandfathers of the African Americans. This is very much unforgivable. Only God can forgive such. The transatlantic slave trade left a lasting impact on African society. It stripped them of millions of their people. It also deeply influenced the cultural and social fabric of the Americas, with the legacy of slavery still being felt up to date. We understand that we also have different and so many African Americans, or rather African Caribbeans, who have come forward, who are knowledgeable, and they are teaching us about slavery. They are telling us the story that we didn't know yet, and they are telling us the story that the white scholar did not want the Africans to know. Such people is like Dr. Painter, the one I'm about to show you right now. She was able to present a very valid argument on how slave trade took place between Europe, America, and Africa. I want us to listen to Dr. Paint, and then by the end of this video, I shall share with you my thoughts, where we shall also have a deep critical analysis.
Let me state categorically that while this is not a history in white versus black, I do not by any means underestimate or ignore the overwhelming importance of black race in America. I am familiar with the truly gigantic literature that explains the meaning, importance, and honest-to-God reality of race when it means black. In comparison with this preoccupation, statutory and biological definitions of white race remain notoriously vague, the leavings of what is not black. But this vagueness does not indicate lack of interest. To the contrary, for another vast historical literature, much less known today, explains the meaning, importance, and honest-to-God reality of the existence of white races. It may seem odd to begin a book on Americans in antiquity, a period long before Europeans discovered the Western Hemisphere and thousands of years before the invention of the concept of race. But given the prevalence of the notion that race is permanent, many believe it possible to trace something recognizable as the white race back more than 2,000 years. In addition, not a few Westerners have attempted to racialize antiquity, making ancient history into white race history and classics into a lily-white field complete with pictures of blonde ancient Greeks. How many of you know that John Singer Sargent mural in the Museum of Art here in Boston with the blonde Apollo and the blonde horses? The blonde ancient Greek narrative may no longer be taught in schools, but it lives on as a myth to be confronted in these pages. Before launching the trip back to ancient times, however, it might be useful to make a few remarks about the role of science, or science, of race. I resist the temptation to place the word science, even theories and assertions of the most spurious, pernicious, or ridiculous kind, in quotation marks, for the task of deciding what is sound science and what is cultural fantasy would quickly become all-consuming. Better to note the qualifications of yesterday's scientists than to brand as mere science their thought that has not stood the test of time. I give scholars of repute in their day pride of place in my pages, no matter that some of their thinking has fallen by the wayside. Today we think of race as a matter of biology, but a second thought reminds us that the meanings of race quickly spill out of merely physical categories. Even in so circumscribed a place as one book, the meanings of white race reach into concepts of labor, gender, and class, and images of personal beauty that seldom appear in analyses of race. Work plays a central part in race talk because the people who do the work are likely to be figured as inherently deserving the toil and poverty of laboring status. It is still assumed, wrongly, that slavery anywhere in the world must rest on a foundation of racial difference. Time and again, the better classes have concluded that those people deserve their lot. It must be something within them. It must be something within them that puts them at the bottom. In modern times, we recognize this kind of reasoning as it relates to black race. But in other times, the same logic was applied to people who were white, especially when they were impoverished immigrants seeking work. Those at the very bottom were slaves. Slavery has helped construct concepts of white race in two contradictory ways. First, American tradition equates whiteness with freedom while consigning blackness to slavery. The history of unfree white people slumbers in popular forgetfulness, though white slavery, like black slavery, moved people around and mixed up human genes on a massive scale. The important demographic role of the various slave trades is all too often overlooked as a historical force. In the second place, the term Caucasian as a designation for white people originates in concepts of beauty related to the white slave trade from Eastern Europe, and whiteness remains embedded in visions of beauty found in art history and popular culture. Today, most Americans envision whiteness as racially indivisible, though ethnically divided. This is the scheme anthropologists laid out in the mid-20th century. By this reckoning, there were only 3 real races: Mongoloid, Negroid, and Caucasoid. The oid makes it sound scientific. But countless ethnicities. Today, however, biologists and geneticists, not to mention literary critics, no longer believe in the physical existence of races, though they recognize the continuing power of racism, the belief that races exist and that some are better than others. It took some 2 centuries to reach this conclusion, after countless racial schemes had spun out countless different numbers of races, even of white races, and attempts at classification produced frustration. Although science today denies race any standing as objective truth, and the US Census faces taxonomic meltdown, many Americans cling to race as the unschooled cling to superstition. So long as racial discrimination remains a fact of life and statistics can be arranged to support racial difference, the American belief in races will endure. But confronted with the actually existing American population, its distribution of wealth, power, and beauty, the notion of American whiteness will continue to evolve as it has since the creation of the American Republic. Chapter 1. Greeks and Scythians. Were there white people in antiquity? Certainly some believe so, as though categories we use today could be read backwards over the millennia. People with light skin certainly existed well before our own times. But did anybody think they were white, or that their character related to their color? No. For neither the idea of race nor the idea of white people had been invented, and people's skin color did not carry useful meaning. What mattered was where they lived. Were their lands damp or dry? Were they virile or prone to impotence? Were they hard or soft? Could they be seduced by the luxuries of civilized society, or were they warriors through and through? What were their habits of life? Rather than as white people, Northern Europeans were known by vague tribal names: Scythians and Celts, then Gauls and Germani. But if one asks, say, who were the Scythians? The question sets us off down a slippery slope, for over time, and especially in earliest times, any search for the ancestors of white Americans perforce leads back to non-literate peoples who left no documents describing themselves. Thus, we must shift through the intellectual history Americans claim as Westerners, keeping in mind that long before science dictated the terms of human difference as race, long before racial scientists began to measure heads and concoct racial theory, ancient Greeks and Romans had their own means of describing the peoples of their world as they knew it more than two millennia ago. And inevitably, the earliest accounts of our story are told from on high, by rulers dominant at a particular time. Power affixes the markers of history. Furthermore, any attempt to trace biological ancestry quickly turns into legend, for human beings have multiplied so rapidly, by 1,000 or more times in some 200 years, and by more than 32,000 times in 300 years. Evolutionary biologists now reckon that the 6 to 7 billion people now living share the same small number of ancestors living 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. These circumstances make nonsense of anybody's pretensions to find a pure racial ancestry. Nor are notions of Western cultural purity any less spurious. Without a doubt, the sophisticated Egyptian, Phoenician, Minoan, and Persian societies deeply influenced the classical culture of ancient Greece, which some still imagine as the West's pure and unique source. That story is still to come, for the obsession with purity, racial and cultural, arose many centuries after the demise of the ancients. Now close your eyes while I read really fast and get you to the back of the book. Chapter 28. I thought I'd never finish this book. The fourth enlargement of American whiteness. Agitating and media dominating as America's civil rights and black power movements were, most of the country's white people might have doubted that the upheaval had much to do with them. They might well have thought that they were individuals who had succeeded by themselves and that race had always meant black people who had not. In fact, by the 1960s, the whole races of Europe discourse had fallen completely out of fashion. Now, while you had your eyes closed and I was reading really fast, we went through the races of Europe part, which is late 19th century, the first quarter of the 20th century. A very important part because it shaped federal legislation dealing with immigration. Books such as William Z. Ripley's Races of Europe, published 1899, once a central reading on race, were now remaindered as useless. And in fact, I own a copy of this book, which comes from the Lowell Public Library. And on the title page is a big stamp, and it says, discarded. And if you were not Jewish, calling Jews a race would send you straight into the anti-Semitic column. Reminders that Jews and Italians had been labeled as races a generation earlier might have prompted a retort that race was used more loosely in the past. This is true. But every use of race has always been loose, whether applied to black, white, yellow, brown, red, or other. No consensus has ever formed on the number of human races or even on the number of white races. Criteria constantly shift according to individual taste and political need. It was clear, however, that in the olden days, that is to say, the 20th century, in the olden days, Jim Crow had kept the colored races apart from whites and African Americans largely hidden behind segregation's veil. Shortly after the end of the Second World War, the end of legalized segregation began to propel black people into national visibility as never before. Concurrently, other changes were soon to deeply alter American sense of the very meanings of race. Little noticed at the time, the openness of the mid-1960s went well beyond the black-white color line. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, was specifically crafted to counter earlier Nordic-minded immigration statutes, especially in terms of Asians. It also allowed for wider immigration from the Western Hemisphere and from Africa. Therein lay the seeds of demographic revolution. New immigrants of the post-1965 era, overwhelmingly from outside Europe, were upending American racial conventions. Asians, greatly rising in number, were rapidly being judged to be smarter and eventually to be richer than native-born whites. Latinos formed 13% of the population by 2000, edging out African Americans as the most numerous minority. The U.S. Census, without peer in scoring the nation's racial makeup, had begun to notice Latin Americans in the 1940s by counting up heterogeneous peoples with Spanish surnames and hastily lumping them together as Hispanics. Though an impossibly crude measurement, it survived until 1977. By that point, the federal government needed more precise racial statistics to enforce civil rights legislation. To this end, the Office of Management and Budget issued statistical Statistical Policy Directive number 15. Here was a change worth noting. In the racially charged decades of the early 20th century, governments at all levels had passed laws to separate Americans by race. Though Jim Crow segregation was supposed to be separate but equal, in practice it worked to discriminate by excluding non-whites from the public sphere, from public institutions, whether from libraries, schools, swimming pools, or the ballot box. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 began to change all that, so that by the late 20th century, the rationale for counting people by race had morphed into a means of keeping track of civil rights enforcement. Statistical Policy Directive number 15 set the terms for racial and ethnic classification throughout American society. By directing federal agencies, including the U.S. Census, to collect data according to 4 races: Black, White, American Indian / Alaska Native, and Asian Pacific Islander. Hawaiian was added later as a concession to protest, so if you protest enough, you can get your race in the census. People often ask me, why do we have just these ones? It's, make a lot of ruckus and get another one. You could get one for Cambridge. Let's see, there was also one ethnic category, Hispanic Latino, which is not racial. Elaboration was good for civil rights, but it opened the way to chaos. Under these guidelines, the Hispanic Latino classification portended enormous turmoil. Now that there was a non-Hispanic white category, did there not also exist Hispanic white people? Yes, no, and other. But just think if you were trying to deal with a census. Faced with the given racial choices on the census of 2000, fully 42.2% of Latinos checked some other race rather than black or white, throwing nearly 6% of Americans into a kind of racial limbo. In addition, the U.S. Census of 2000 had to increase, excuse me, a deeper and more personal recognition of multiracial identities. For the first time, respondents were allowed to describe themselves as belonging to one or more of 15 racial identities. As so often in the past, and adding confusion, the list of races included nationalities. And there's a picture of question 6 from the, thank you, but I can't because I'll, see figure 28.1, question 6 from the U.S. Census of 2000. This expansion now allowed for 126 ethno-racial groups, or for purists, 63 races. It did not take much analytical ability to see that any notion of race lay so diluted as to lose much of its punch. And taxonomy was rapidly buckling much further under the weight of interracial sex. Somebody complained to me recently that my book has a lot of sex in it. And it does. That's what people do. You don't notice sex if the children, just are neutral. People notice sex if the children are obviously mixed-race children. So if you have a mixed-race child, it's like, oh, you have sex. So there's nothing new here. Americans' disorderly sexual habits have always overflowed neat racial lines and driven race thinkers crazy. Asians and Native American Indians had the highest rates of interracial marriage, but others, including African Americans, now often married and had children with people from outside their racial ethnic group. By 1990, American families were so heterogeneous that 1/7 of whites, 1/3 of blacks, 4/5 of Asians, and 19/20 of Native American Indians were closely related to someone of a different racial group. With some 12% of young people now calling themselves multiracial, it is expected that by 2050, 10% of whites and blacks and more than 50% of Latinos, Asians, and Native American Indians will be married to someone outside their racial group. With so many non-white and white Americans marrying willy-nilly, the barriers between the progeny of European immigrants have largely disappeared. Among white people, 3 out of 4 marriages had already crossed ethnic boundaries by 1980. A generation later, very few white Americans had 4 grandparents from the same country. Crèvecoeur's European-derived American, This New Man, and this also goes to the part you heard while I was reading really fast, had arrived. William Z. Ripley had predicted this outcome in 1908, fearing, above all, the inharmonious mixing of Italian men and Irish women. But he would have been forced to reconsider his prediction that such a racial mix would make Americans ugly. We have already seen the lowering of racial boundaries starting in the 1940s, when ethnic began replacing race as applied to the descendants of European immigrants. The use of racial groups for white people has become a moribund category, too, partly because white people are so mixed up. Finally, the perquisites of mere whiteness count for less in the present situation, while the stigma of blackness, once just 1 drop sufficed to curse the white-looking individual, also seems less mortal. Any of you remember the movies where the white-looking woman, she's really beautiful and she's living a nice life and a nice guy doctor falls in love with her, and then it turns out she has 1 drop of black blood in her life? You remember that? Do you think that would happen now? Back in the 20th century, white people were assumed to be rich, or at least middle class, as well as more beautiful, powerful, and smart. Did I hear a snort? As citizens and scholars, they said what was needed to be known and monopolized the study of other people, with themselves hardly being marked or scrutinized in return. Think of Francis Amasa Walker and William Z. Ripley, for whom formal education, New England ancestry, and useful connections assured authority. Half a century later, the upheaval of the civil rights turned the looking glass around, bringing white people under scrutiny. Think of Malcolm X and James Baldwin. Today, the attractive qualities that Saxons, Anglo-Saxons, Nordics, and whites were assumed to monopolize are also to be found elsewhere. After a string of non-white Mrs. America, Jennifer Lopez and Beyonce Knowles are celebrated as Hollywood beauties. Vijay Singh, Tiger Woods, and the Williams sisters, Venus and Serena, dominate elite sports. Robert Johnson, founder of the BET Network, Bill Cosby, and the financier Alphonse Fletcher Jr. have made millions. Oprah Winfrey is rich and famous. Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice have been secretaries of state, and Alberto Gonzalez, attorney general. Even more to the point of uniting power and beauty, Barack Obama is president of the United States. First Lady Michelle Obama, whose skin color alone would have condemned her to ugliness in the 20th century, figures as an icon of beauty and intelligence on the global stage. None of these individuals is white, but being white these days is not what it used to be. Thus, it is sensible to conclude that the American is undergoing a 4th great enlargement. Although race may still seem overweening, without legal recognition, it is less important than in the past. the dark of skin, who also happen to be rich, say people of South Asian, African American, and Hispanic background, and the light of skin from anywhere, who are beautiful, are now well on the way to inclusion. Is this the end of race in America? At the turn of the 21st century, it was starting to look that way. In 1997, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists urged the American government to phase out the use of race as a data category and substitute ethnic categories instead. You know, I've been thinking about that. I don't think that would have made any difference at all. But you think it would have made a difference? No. Anyway, they urged it in 1997. Geneticists studying DNA, the constituent material of genes that issues instructions to our bodies in response to our surroundings, were also concluding that race as a biological category made no sense. The habit of relating heredity to the environment may be traced back to antiquity, but early 19th century racial thinkers turned the notion around, deeming race a permanent marker for innate superiority or inferiority. Not until the 1850s did the influence of environment on heredity get rescued with Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Darwin described a world much older than the biblical 5,000 years, reasoning that heredity was not fixed, that generation after generation, living things change in response to their surroundings. Arguments over race in the human genome have subsided of late, leaving us with some intriguing data about personal appearance. Prevailing racial schemes now rest once again on concepts of skin color, hence black people and white people. But widely recognized is the fact that not only are black people actually various shades of brown and yellow, but so too are white people, merely somewhat lighter and often with a lot more pink. As Blumenbach realized in the late 18th century, one group's skin color shades gradually into another's. There are no clearly demarcated lines. Some people who identify as black may have lighter colored skin than others who identify as white. Siblings with the same mother and father can display a range of skin colors. Race may be about pigment, but what makes people's skin light or dark? Skin color is a byproduct of two kinds of melanin, red to yellow pheomelanin and dark brown to black eumelanin, in reaction to sunlight. And several genes interact to make people light or dark, reddish, brownish, or yellowish. Ancient scholars were wiser than they knew when they related skin color to climate. Today's biologists concur. Sunny climates do make people dark-skinned, and dark, cold climates make people light-skinned. How much of which sort of melanin people have in their skin, and to what degree it is expressed, depends entirely over time on exposure to the sun's ultraviolet or UV radiation. Melanin both protects against excessive ultraviolet radiation and allows sufficient UV radiation to enter the body. Too much UV radiation causes skin cancer and can lead to death. Not enough can weaken the bones. Where are we now? Mapping the human genome elicited initial proclamations of human kindredness across the globe. Then race talk inscribed racial difference on our genes. That talk has not disappeared, but ideally we would realize that human beings' short history relates us all to one another. To speak in racial terms, incessant human migration has made us all multiracial. Does this mean the human genome or civil rights or desegregation have ended the tyranny of race in America? Almost certainly not. The fundamental black-white binary endures, even though the category of whiteness, or we might say more precisely, a category of non-blackness, effectively expands. As before, the black poor remain outside the concept of the American, remain as an alien race of degenerate families. And these terms, alien race and degenerate families, are terms that come up in the part of the book I read really fast, and have to do with poor white families. Multicultural middle class may diversify the suburbs and college campuses, but the face of poor, segregated inner cities remains black. For quite some time, many observers have held that money and interracial sex would solve the race problem, and indeed, in some cases, they have. Nevertheless, poverty in a dark skin endures as the opposite of whiteness, driven by an age-old social yearning to characterize the poor as permanently other and inherently inferior. And here the book ends. Thanks. This is something I don't know about. I know about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which excluded working class Asians. It allowed for diplomats and students to come briefly, but not workers. So that was the first race-based immigration exclusion act in American history. I also know about two cases, one in 1921 and one in 1923, of Ozawa, who was Japanese, who sued to naturalize because he was white. And the judges said, "You may be white, but you're not Caucasian." And then Thind, who sued to be naturalized as white, and said, "I'm Caucasian." And they said, "You may be Caucasian, but you're not white." Yeah. In a sense, the explosion of the importance of whiteness is uniquely American, or I should say American in the larger sense of the hemisphere, based on African slavery. So the black-white dichotomy is it's a big part of the law of the land, but it's not all there is. You're absolutely right that in Europe, the Slavs became a much more important group of people to racialize and keep at bay. So Gobineau, for instance, was worried about the Slavs. And when his 1850s translators in the American South translated him, they were more worried about the blacks. And so they had to really mess up what he had to say about black people. And he thought slavery was bad for the United States. They had to take that part out, too. So the European stuff doesn't translate seamlessly, but the idea of permanent, measurable racial difference does translate, though it's used for different people at different times. Yeah. It's going to be both bigger and smaller. Bigger in the sense that the Tiger Woodses of the world will be in. And when I say whiteness, I mean the kind of the qualities, the good stuff, the things you can do, the power of whiteness, the beauty of whiteness. And you notice that Tiger Woods has gotten uglier since he got into trouble. Yeah, yeah.
Just another black guy.
Yeah, he used to be so beautiful and young, and now he's old and ugly. Yeah. But at any rate, that's what sin does. Yeah. So it's getting bigger, but it's also getting smaller in the way that I mentioned about one drop, is no longer enough to kill it off. So as more and more people get in, it's going to be worth less and less. Yeah. So, our country is pathetically unequal in income and pathologically unequal in wealth. And those are the big qualifiers, I think, in the world to come. 90% and 10%. Scientific. What made the alien races of the early 20th century into white people? Federal policy. Do you want more? The New Deal, which mobilized generations of American-born voters whose parents and grandparents were immigrants of the so-called alien races. The Second World War, which needed national unity, which also reached out to black people, but sought to tamp down the differences between the European races still. And so it's from that moment in the 40s that you get Negroid, Caucasoid, and Mongoloid. So there are races, but they're not the ones you thought. And then just as important is the GI Bill, which was administered locally on purpose. So it meant that in the South, local elites could white line it. Some black GIs were able to take advantage of it, but proportionally not very many. So that really gave the children of the alien races an economic step up. And then the Veterans Administration and the FHA's lending policies, which until the Fair Housing Act allowed for racial discrimination. So the new suburbs of the post-war era, like Levittown, were for whites only, but they put together Jews, Irish, Italian, Slavs, everybody together in the name of whiteness. And they were like 99.99.99% white. I said that it's taken on a life of its own in the United States in a way that it has not in other places. But the Europeans did use the word white. So for Linnaeus, for instance, I mean, these are people who were writing in Latin, I should say. But for Linnaeus in 1758, he had 4 different groups of people and designated them by territory. So there were Europeans, Africans, Asians, and Americans. And then when he talked about what it was about them, he listed white, and he also listed temperament. In the 18th century with Blumenbach, later on in the 18th century with Blumenbach and his 5 races, they still have a geographic basis, but part of what makes the word Caucasian, and Blumenbach was the person who applied it to Europeans. Why he used that word was because white people were the most beautiful people in the world. Aren't you glad to know that? What I find so amazing are the people who propagate these things are just ordinary looking people, you know, and I had to look and look and look to try to find Caucasians and Circassians and Georgians who are supposed to be the most beautiful people in the world, when it turns out it's really Hungarians. But to find images of them, and when you find images, well, the first images you find of Caucasians are really old people who eat yogurt and live a long time. So anyway, it's based on beauty. I think we are more class-driven now than back in the 20th century. But I think the relationship of class and race in one person's or one neighborhood's experience really has to do with that neighborhood and that experience. So I don't think there's any one answer. You remember, we're 320, 30, 40 million people. So there's no one answer. But one thing is clear, and that is that race does still count. Yeah. Yeah, that's a big issue. And if I were up to writing forever, or another book, it might be interesting to see to what extent the pattern of Jewish discussion of the assimilation, cultural plurality has shown or has gone the way that black people might go. I don't know. I think it'll be really, really interesting. But what I did remember, well, you probably don't remember, but I said very quickly that calling Jews a race if you were not Jewish, because there is a discussion among Jews as to whether or not Jews are a race. And some people say yes, and some people say no, and some people say, well, yes, but don't talk about it, and some people say no, but don't talk about it, you know. So that is not a settled question among Jews. What I see in the literature is generational shifts. So that people who are my age, born in the 40s, might have a sense of kind of being both Jewish and American, but, not wanting to buy into white American completely.
Now, after carefully listening to what Dr. Neil Painter has given us, here is my deep critical analysis on the topic of race, racism, and whiteness as a designation for Caucasians. We brought whiteness out of nothingness and tagged it onto people. We made them an index, and we are here to watch that, to understand how it came to be. You understand? Now, racism, and the concept of whiteness as a designation for Caucasians are deeply rooted in historical, social, and ideological constructs. These concepts have evolved over centuries, shaping our political, economic, and cultural forces. Understanding the origins requires tracing the intersection of scientific theories, colonialism, and societal structures that created or rather perpetuated these ideas. Now, the origin of race. The concept of race is not biological, but a social construct that emerged as societies sought to categorize themselves in human diversity. Early societies, particularly in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, recognized human variation based on cultural, linguistic, and regional differences. But these distinctions were not rigidly hierarchical or tied to biological inferiority or superiority. In the 17th and the 18th century, European exploration and colonial expansion brought increased interaction with diverse populations. European thinkers and explorers sought to classify and rank human differences, influenced by the Enlightenment era's focus on categorization and taxonomy. Pioneers like Carl Linnaeus developed systems to clarify life forms, including humans, into distinct groups. Linnaeus' taxonomy divided humanity into 4 races, which are tied to continents: Africans, Europeans, Asians, and Native Americans, often attributing stereotypical traits to each. This pseudo-scientific classification was further entrenched by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, a German anthropologist who introduced the term Caucasian. I think I did a video about this and you guys really loved that video. Blumenbach, let's continue, identified 5 human races and argued that Caucasian region was the cradle of humanity because of the perceived physical beauty of its inhabitants. His work, though influential, contributed to hierarchy that placed Caucasians at the top, reinforcing ideas of European superiority and non-European inferiority. The birth of racism is near. The birth of racism is now, according to this timeline of history. Racism as an ideology stems from the justification of inequalities between groups, particularly during the period, or rather the era, of European colonization. The transatlantic slave trade, which began in the 16th century, necessitated ideological justification for the enslavement and exploitation of African peoples. By portraying Africans as biologically and morally inferior, European colonizers legitimized slavery, using race as the basis for dehumanization. The Age of Enlightenment, despite its emphasis on reason and equality, paradoxically reinforced racism. Scholars such as Voltaire and Immanuel Kant perpetuated ideas of racial hierarchies, framing non-European peoples as inherently less capable of intellectual and cultural achievement. Scientific racism gained momentum in the 19th century with figures like Samuel Morton, who claimed cranial measurements proved Caucasians' superiority. These theories laid to the groundwork for systemic racism, where social, political, and economic systems were organized to privilege one race over others. Institutionalized practices such as segregation, discriminatory laws, and colonization perpetuated these ideologies, ensuring the dominance of Caucasians in Europe and its colonies. Here is the emergence of whiteness as a concept. The concept of whiteness evolved alongside the notion of race and was primarily constructed as a tool for power. During the 17th century in colonial America, indentured European servants and African slaves often worked together, Fearing solidarity between these groups, colonial elites began to delineate privileges for Europeans based on their whiteness. This distinction created a hierarchical, or rather a racial hierarchy, that subordinated black people and unified Europeans under a shared identity, even across class divisions. The legal codification of whiteness followed in the laws like the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705, which distinguished between white and black individuals, assigning privileges to the former. Whiteness became synonymous with citizenship, land ownership, and freedom, while blackness was associated with enslavement and subjugation. In the 19th and the 20th centuries, we saw the expansion of whiteness as an identity. Immigrant groups such as Irish, Italian, and Jewish people, initially excluded from the category of white, eventually assimilated into it, reinforcing its stability as a social construct. This process demonstrated that whiteness was not a fixed racial identity, but a shifting boundary used to consolidate power. This is so deep. This is goodness. How one human being can just think they are superior of another, and they just don't end with that. They continue influencing other human beings like him to think that another kind of people are inferior and they are superior, until now it becomes a worldwide problem. Now, whiteness, colonialism, and global power dynamics. Whiteness gained global influence during European imperialism, which exported racial hierarchies to colonized regions. In Africa, Asia, and Americas, whiteness became the standard of civilization, of progress, and modernity. The ideology justified colonial rule, resource exploitation, and cultural erasure. Colonial systems institutionalized whiteness through education, governance, and economic policies, ensuring the dominance of European settlers and elites. Whiteness was upheld as the ideal, while indigenous and non-European identities were marginalized or demonized. In the 20th century, whiteness continued to be a central construct in global power relations. The eugenic movement, which sought to improve the human race through selective breeding, was deeply rooted in the idea of white superiority. This ideology influenced policies such as forced sterilization, immigration restriction, and even the Holocaust that we had between the Nazis and the Jews. Also, we've had some critical perspective on this ideology of whiteness. In recent decades, scholars and activists have challenged the concept of whiteness, exposing it as a construct designed to maintain power and privilege. Critical race theorists argue that whiteness is not an inherent identity, but a social position tied to systemic advantages. Peggy Malconti's concept of white privilege highlights the unearned benefits that come with being identified as white in societies structured around racial hierarchies. Decolonial movements and anti-racist activism have sought to dismantle the legacy of whiteness by promoting equity and recognizing the contribution of non-white peoples. These efforts emphasize that whiteness, like race, is not biologically determined but socially constructed and maintained. The origins of race, racism, and whiteness as a concept are deeply intertwined with the historical processes of exploration, colonization, and exploitation. These constructs have been used to justify inequality and consolidate power, shaping societies for centuries. Understanding these origins is crucial for dismantling the structures of racism and promoting a more equitable world. Recognizing race and whiteness as construct but not inherent human features, rather than immutable truth. Race and racism and whiteness are not immutable truth. They're false, This opens the door to reimagining societies. When we understand this, we get to understand that having the truth opens the door to reimaging social relationship and creating systems rooted in justice and inclusivity. Yeah, that's all I have to share, and that's my research for you based on this video. If you get value in what I do, kindly support me on Patreon. It helps me help you. Just go to Patreon, donate something. I will surely appreciate. Share the video, share with your loved ones. Do all that. Thank you. Give a super thanks if you may. Remember, it's not about the money, it's about the message. Yeah. So see you in the next one, and love yourself as a black person.